Good morning. Time now a minute after 8 o'clock in the morning in Tokyo, Tuesday, July 12th, 2022. Welcome to another edition of the online morning seminar organized by the World Bank Tokyo office. My name is Koichi Omori. I am Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize a series of online seminars starting at 8 o'clock in the morning in Japan Standard Time, introducing the latest report presented by the World Bank Group economists and specialists. Today, we are featuring the latest edition of the Migration and Development Brief, the 36th edition of it, which was released on May 11th by the Global Knowledge Partnership on Migration and Development, NOMAD, a global hub for policy and knowledge on the migration and development issues hosted and housed by the World Bank. The report is subtitled War in the Pandemic, Implications of the Ukraine Crisis and COVID-19 on Global Governance of Migration and Remittances Flows. Connecting from Washington, we have Dilip Rasa, the lead economist and the head of NOMAD. This is his fourth appearance in the morning seminar programs. Dilip, welcome back to our program. How are you?
Thank you. Good morning to you.
Great. Thank you very much. So we'll listen to Dilip presenting the main point of the latest report in the next 30-40 minutes. After his presentation, I'll read a question that we received from our viewers in advance. Thank you very much for sending those questions. Please send more questions even during the seminar using online form posted on the announcement page of this seminar on the website, or you can simply post your question on the chat section of the YouTube screen. I'll read your question after Dilip's presentation, asking him to respond. With that, I would like to ask Dilip to formally come in to start your presentation. Dilip, please.
Thank you, Koichi. It's always a pleasure to talk to your audience. Hopefully, one of these days, I'll actually be there in person to present it. So the context for today's presentation is that we had the COVID-19 crisis that is still continuing, and then we got into a war, a situation that has really gone beyond its boundaries, or beyond the boundaries of the immediate two countries in conflict, to affect the rest of the world and or the world economy. And in that context, what is happening on migration and on the flow of money, particularly migrant remittances, but also cross-border payments. That's sort of the main topic that I'm going to address in the presentation. And I'll share my presentation. Let me know if you are able to see it, Koichi.
Yes, we are seeing your presentation.
Very good. So this is the report we released on May 11, and in fact, it was timed literally the week before the International Migration Review Forum, which took place the following week. So starting May 17th, I think, there were 4 days of meetings in New York at the United Nations. And the IMRF, International Migration Review Forum, was the first opportunity for the global community to come together after the Global Compact on Migration was signed in 2018 in Marrakesh. And we wanted to talk about the state of global governance of migration as opposed to refugees. That is, for the refugees, there is a separate Global Compact on refugees. So on Global Compact on migration, what is the state of play, and how does the governance mechanism or the governance issues, how do they get impacted by the two crises, the COVID-19 crisis and the conflict, the Ukraine crisis? So that is the main theme of the presentation. So let me start with some data. We expect that by the end of 2022, remittance flows to low and middle income countries would reach about $630 billion. And at that level, remittance flows to low and middle income countries would compare very well with foreign direct investment flows to developing countries. And if you excluded China, then remittances would exceed foreign direct investment as well as ODA, official development assistance. And that's what you see in this chart. The red line, the steady red line, almost like a straight line, is the flow of remittances. And indeed, the surprise to us was that as countries have come up with new data, revised data, and more countries have provided data for last 2 or 3 years. In fact, even during 2020, the beginning of the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, remittances did not fall. You might remember that 2 years ago, four issues of the brief ago, my first presentation perhaps to Tokyo, we pointed out that we were expecting at that time a major decline in remittance flows because of COVID-19 crisis. And now in hindsight, with new data and updated data from different countries, we are finding that remittance flows actually did not decline at all. There was a small increase even in 2020. So the story about remittance flows is their resilience, that even in the face of crisis, and especially during crisis, remittances hold up well and they might even increase, whereas foreign direct investment might decline. In that sense, remittances are a very stable source of external financing for developing countries. Now, the largest recipient countries are India, Mexico, China, Philippines, Egypt, in dollar terms. A surprise was Mexico kind of surpassing China to become the second largest recipient of remittances. And I'll have more to talk about Mexico in a minute. But then if you look at countries that are smaller in size, then as a share of GDP, remittances are very high in Lebanon, Tonga, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and small island nations. Now, Lebanon is a country in crisis. Tonga is a small island nation. Tajikistan, Kyrgyz Republic, they are also small economies, but they are highly dependent on remittances from Russia. So I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. So growth of remittances were actually surprisingly strong in Latin America and the Caribbean region. Indeed, in 2021, last year, remittance flows to the region increased by 25%. That is the sort of the reflection of Mexico's growth rate. Now, by contrast, the only region where we would expect a decline, a negative growth rate in remittances in 2022 seems to be Europe and Central Asia region because of the Ukraine crisis. And it is actually not because of Ukraine where remittances will increase significantly. That's what we think. It is impact of the Ukraine crisis on other Central Asian countries like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. That's why remittances are expected to fall. So in the context of, let's say, Ukraine, remittance flows are significantly larger than foreign direct investment. Remittance flows in 2021 in Ukraine was over $18 billion. Foreign direct investment was around $6 billion. So remittances were more than 3 times the size of foreign direct investment in Ukraine. And one interesting change that has happened in Ukraine compared to 2015 is that in 2015, about a quarter, 26% of remittances, the green arc of the green part of the pie there, 26% of remittances to Ukraine in 2015 came from Russia. By 2021, actually that has gone down significantly. Instead, the share of remittances coming from Poland has increased significantly. And that coincides with significant migration from Ukraine to Russia, away from Russia to Poland. So that is the main phenomenon. And then the question is, how will the impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict work out through the system? And it is basically the fact that with Russian economy not doing that well, remittance flows coming out of Russia to various countries in the world, particularly Central Asia, are expected to decline. And in the past, we had noticed that outward remittances from Russia were highly correlated with oil price, global oil price. And that seems to be the case even now. But going forward, oil price has increased quite significantly. That's a positive for remittance flows out of Russia. But there are two negatives. One is that the economy and economic activity in Russia have been impacted by the conflict, and they are expected to decline significantly in 2022. With that, the need of the Russian economy for migrant workers from Central Asia will also decline, and that would impact the number of migrants from these countries, Central Asian countries, but also their income levels, and therefore remittances going from Russia to Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, that would be impacted. So that is the first round effect. The second round effect is because of the fact that Russian remittances flow in terms of ruble, and ruble is ruble's value, ruble's exchange rate with respect to US dollar is changing. That would impact dollar valuation of Russian remittances to Central Asian countries. So it's simply a valuation effect. And in the early days when we were working on these calculations that are reported in this report, the ruble had depreciated almost 25% at some point. And since then it has come back up, but we really don't know the true value of ruble right now. It is not a flexible market. It's not the price, the exchange rate is not market determined. So with that caveat, we were expecting a significant decline in remittance flows to Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and all. And one interesting factor that causing a bit of confusion for this sort of analysis is that in the past, oil price and Russian ruble were correlated in a positive way. So if oil price is high, Russian economy is doing well, and ruble strengthens against the US dollar. That correlation has been broken, not only recently because of the conflict, during the conflict, but even before that, since January 21, there seems to have been a divergence between oil price and Russian ruble. So that is where some confusion, some risks are definitely there to our thinking. So with that, we think that remittance flows to Ukraine will rise by more than 20% in 2022. And remittance flows to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and many other countries, Uzbekistan, Moldova, Georgia, all of them will decline quite significantly as well. The overall impact on the region being a slight negative. Now, more recent data since we published this report are showing that remittances to Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and all, the decline has not been that strong. So we may be wrong again, but we have to see. So with that, an interesting point about the Ukraine situation. So far, we have seen numbers like 6 million, more than 6 million people have moved by now to Poland, mostly Poland, but out of Ukraine. But also, there are another 6 to 8 million people who have been displaced within Ukraine. And entirely possible that a significant part of the displaced people might go out of the country unless the situation returns to peace sometime soon. So with that, it's not clear what would happen to migration situation, refugee movements from Ukraine. The surprise thing is that with the crisis, there has been, most countries in the world, and definitely US and European countries have been very welcoming of Ukrainian migrants. And they have given them access to services, access to jobs, access to even some subsidy and grant programs. So that would mean that remittance flows to Ukraine will actually rise more than that 20% we were predicting. So that brings me to sort of some of the policy questions. What should government policy responses look like during the crisis? And we are talking about two crises here now, the war and also the pandemic that is continuing. So clearly we need to support migrants. And in supporting migrants, there is now widespread support for Ukrainian migrants and refugees. But there is a worry, and rightly so, that there is not enough of a focus, or focus has even shifted away from other refugees and migrants in the world, particularly from migrants from Africa, Afghanistan, refugees from Africa and Afghanistan, and to an extent even Central America. So I think there is a need to bring back the sort of focus to the global phenomenon of migrants and refugees rather than only Ukrainian migrants and refugees. This is not to say, not to imply at all that we should reduce support for Ukrainian migrants, but this is to imply that we should maintain, if not increase, the support for non-Ukrainian migrants and refugees as well. One interesting issue that has come up with the Ukraine situation is that because of the restriction on migration of adult male who are required in the country during the conflict, because of that restriction, a lot of recent migration due to the conflict from Ukraine has been for women and children. And that opens up the possibility of trafficking, of abuse. So there is an added need to look at the gender dimension of the migratory movements from Ukraine, and protection of migrants from trafficking and from abuse. That is very important. And another issue that I didn't get to highlight, but I should have, is related to the significant increase in remittance flows to Latin America and the Caribbean region that I mentioned. That 2021, there was a 25% increase in remittance flows to the Latin America and the Caribbean region, and Mexico has registered an increase of 20% or 25% for 2 years in a row now. So that's very, very significant. And in the report, we point out that a part of the reason for increase in remittance flows to Mexico is due to an increase in the size of transit migrants. migrants who were crossing through Mexico to get to the United States. Many of them have been stopped at the border and pushed back, and they have been asked to actually stay in Mexico while their papers are being processed. This remain in Mexico sort of policy has swelled the number of transit migrants in Mexico, but those migrants are receiving money from their relatives either in the US or in Europe or back from where they came from. So they are receiving money, and that is showing up as remittances as well. So that 25% increase in remittances to Latin America and the Caribbean region is not all because of the normal traditional migrant remittances. A part of that is also because of transit migrant related remittances. The effect on the local economy is similar to the effect of an increase in tourism. So it is positive, but the transitoriness of tourism is there. If the transit migrants one day move on, then remittance flows will decline. That is not the case with migrant remittances, where migrants, as long as the stock of migrants is high or increasing, remittance flows will continue to increase. So that's an important point I wanted to mention. And this brings me to a final point, that during the crisis, we have also seen an increase in return migration. As jobs have been scarce, or people have felt like they don't want to, for example, in some sectors like tourism, hotels and all that, travel industry, there was a decline in the number of employees, and many of those workers have gone back home. That also means that on the one hand, they might have taken their money with them, so an increase in remittances, but long term is not a great thing. And those returning migrants, if they return in large numbers, they would need support as well. So those are sort of two or three major policy recommendations during the crisis. Of course, there is also the need to support the remittance infrastructure during the crisis. And the most important thing that comes to mind is that think about the war in Ukraine, people stranded wherever they are, or they are in shelter in different places. Cash is actually really needed in those times of crisis, because they can't go to the banks, they can't use checks, credit cards that easily. So cash, access to cash is important during a crisis. And much more sort of away from the war situation, when we think about the crisis situation and countries and families in those countries needing more access to help, financial help from their own family members and from everyone else, but particularly from their family members, the dependence on remittances has gone up. And at the same time, it may not be that easy to receive remittances. So access to bank accounts is really needed, because digital channels of sending money are more conducive for use during a crisis, during a COVID-19 crisis, because people don't want to touch cash, and you don't want to go to stores to send money or receive money. So using digital channels, mobile wallets, and internet-based mechanisms is desirable, but that brings the question of access to bank accounts, because not all people have access to bank accounts. A large number of migrant workers and their families don't have access. So those were sort of some of the main issues, policy issues relating to what to do during the crisis. One issue that goes beyond the crisis, that was there before the crisis and that will be there later, and indeed it is a part of the Sustainable Development Goal indicators, is the issue of reducing remittance costs. Remittance cost, the cost of sending money, continues to be high. The Sustainable Development Goal target is 3% of the value remitted, and the current level is slightly over 6%, the global average. And in most of the regions, the cost of sending money is actually over 6%. So there is a need to reduce remittance costs. Interestingly, I thought that in the case of Ukraine, because because of its proximity and level of development, proximity to Europe and level of development, particularly to Poland, right? Proximity to Poland. I thought the cost of sending money to Ukraine would be very, very low, but actually it is not. It is still about 5%. So with an $18 billion sort of limit, if the cost of remittances to Ukraine could be reduced by 2 percentage points, that would translate to $400 million of savings in the hands of Ukrainian migrants per year. $400 million in savings for migrants, Ukrainian migrants per year. That is very, very significant. And if you eliminate the cost 5%, that's quite significant, right? That same thing can be said about actually reducing global remittance costs by 2% on a 630 billion level. That's roughly $12 billion per year. So that's quite high. And by the way, sending money from Japan to anywhere else is among the most expensive in the world. So there is scope for reducing costs of remittances going out of Japan as well. This is an important point to note. So if we look at the cost structure in remittance corridors in East Asia and the Pacific region, sending money to Philippines tends to be very low, but sending money to China or from Thailand can be very high. And Japan is not here, but I think that would be the same story if we were to include Japan. I think somehow that data point was missing, so we couldn't include it. Now, that brings me to implications of the two crises, the war and the pandemic, on global governance of migration. Just to point out that the global governance of migration, actually, the Global Compact on Migration, which was under review during the International Migration Review Forum, it started with focusing mostly on international migrants, and then it has expanded its scope to climate-driven migrants. And we don't have numbers on climate-driven migrants and even definition of climate-driven migrants, because most of the migratory movements, when people are driven by climate change, would probably show up as people leaving a region that is affected by drought or famine or by flooding or natural disasters. And they will not be attributed directly to climate change. So there is an interesting situation there. But just the international migrant stock is about 250 million. And the Global Compact basically reflects the international migrants, economic migrants alone. So it is international economic migrants. The forced migrants, that includes refugees and internally displaced people, IDPs, they are covered by the Global Compact on Refugees. And indeed, Global Compact on Refugees mostly focuses on international forced migrants, meaning refugees and asylum seekers. That number is about 35 million. Compare that with international migrants of 250 million. So the bigger issue is 250 million international migration or migrants. And that number is going to grow because of climate change, because of income differences, because of demographic change, rising fertility, a lot of people, hundreds of millions of people joining the working age population in Africa, in Asia. And yet the global community tends to focus on refugees much more, and there are frameworks in place for them. So there is an interesting situation now with the Ukraine crisis. The worry is that there would be even more focus. There is actually even more focus on refugees than before, and more focus on Ukrainian migrants and refugees in particular. So we have an interesting but difficult situation. And that actually was the tenor of the meetings at the International Migration Review Forum at the UN. It was not a meeting of Global Compact on Refugees, it was a meeting of Global Compact on Migration, and yet more discussion and more mentions were made of migration, of refugees, not of migrants. So that remains a major risk. This also points to an interesting point that I have made before. When you have like the number of migrants rise from 1 million to 3 million, 4 million, as is happening in the case of Poland right now, with migrants from Ukraine coming in large numbers in a very, very short time. Countries like Poland, they need help from outside. They need external help. Now, this is not specific only to Poland and this particular Ukrainian crisis situation. The same thing happened with, let's say, Venezuelan migrants going to Colombia. Several million went to Colombia in a very short period of time. And prior to that, similar things happened with refugee movements from Syria to Turkey. Several million people landed in Turkey. So all these countries, Turkey or Colombia or Ukraine, they need help. Now, there are millions of Sudanese refugees in Uganda now, Somalis in Kenya. So, Afghans in Pakistan, right? In fact, 86% or 90% of refugees in the world are hosted by neighboring countries in the south, in the developing world. So, when there is a rapid influx of migrants or refugees into a country, the host country needs support from the external community. And it is not enough to say, we sympathize with you. Actually, we need to show them the money. We need to show them the money. So there is a need to create a concessional financing facility for host countries that are experiencing large influx of migrants and refugees. The similar needs are there for origin countries that are experiencing large-scale return migration. It is the same problem. A large number of people come into a particular city or a small region, that overwhelms the system. And if appropriate financial interventions and economic interventions are not made in time, then that can lead to violence and unwanted outcomes. So there is a need to create the global concessional financing facility for migration. There is one for refugees, but there is a need to create one for migration. That brings me to the final part of my presentation. It's about the sanctions that were imposed through the SWIFT on Russia on international transactions, part of the economic sanctions program imposed by US and Europe, and you could say global community perhaps, on Russia was to stop all kinds of large payments through the SWIFT international payment system. When that sort of sanctions are imposed, it immediately brings into question the vulnerability of, let's say, a system like the SWIFT system, the vulnerability of the international payment system in question to manipulation by specific powerful countries. And that then brings a national security dimension to payment systems. What was earlier a normal thing, you have the economic activities and financial system just mirrors the economic activities. Now we are going into first the sanctions in terms of trade, oil purchase and all that. So real economic activities are being sanctioned. And then it is also being followed up with sanctions on the payment systems. That actually raises risks of countries joining payment systems. So that gives rise to the possibility of multipolar payment systems with multiple central bank digital currencies and many countries taking the lead. So I think that is going to be a phenomenon for a while to come. I mean, what September 11 did to travel system, I think the sanctions against Russia through the SWIFT system might have similar effect for a long time to come on international payment systems. So that would mean that lack of interoperability between national payment systems would get exacerbated, would get intensified even further, and that would then keep costs high, including raising the cost of foreign exchange conversions, foreign exchange commissions. And in all this process, unbanked people would still be left out. There are still somewhere around 1.8 billion people in the world who do not have bank accounts, and those people cannot access digital channels. Now, a few words about digital channels. When we talk about digital currencies, we should include mobile wallets, central bank digital currencies, and cryptocurrencies. And there are questions about how we compare digital currencies across different dimensions. One dimension would be accessibility. Second is anonymity of transactions. Third, whether the instrument is a bearer instrument, like you can anytime you have the instrument, you can give it to somebody. Then no need for intermediaries. Then operational efficiency, and then programmability for specific uses, and service availability 24/7 by 365 all the time. These are sort of some of the criteria one could use. And if you begin to think about then comparing central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, with cash, which is currency notes, and an augmented real-time gross settlement system, RTGS plus system, then the spider charts would show that no one system is better than the others. All three will have to coexist in the future. If you just focus on central bank digital currencies, there are three kinds that are being talked about. One is cash equivalent. The second is account-based, meaning everyone has an account with the central bank. That is unlikely to happen except in the case of maybe a small island nation. But more likely, a system would be a hybrid system or intermediated system where the central bank gives access to maybe some large banks, some large fintech companies, and those companies then have customers like the current situation now, like us having bank accounts, and those banks had access to central bank payment systems. Maybe that's the more likely mechanism. And even there, the choices are not that clear. Cash still does quite well as an instrument. So I think the message is that all currencies, all forms will coexist. Within central bank digital currency and comparing central bank digital currency with cryptocurrency like Bitcoin or Ethereum, also you see that they are not a solution. This was a question during the Ukraine crisis as well, and you can see Ukraine crisis is not using a lot of cryptocurrencies, and the cryptocurrency prices are down by 70-80% now, I think, right? And down from Bitcoin 67 or 69,000 down to 20,000 now. So it's a significant drop. But again, no one thing wins. One key message, again, is that unbanked persons are not going to have access to digital currencies anytime soon. So with that, the future, cryptocurrencies will continue to coexist with central bank digital currencies and cash. Cryptos are not operationally efficient yet. Price volatility remains a big challenge. Now, hybrid CBDCs will have greater chance of applications in business to business, government to people, and people-to-people, person-to-person transactions. Banks will continue to exist, and lack of interoperability will continue to affect efficiency and foreign exchange spreads. Unbanked persons will be still left out. So with that, I would stop my presentation now, and over to you, Koichi.
Thank you very much, Dilip, for your keynote presentation. Before reading the questions that we received from our viewers, let me ask you to introduce a little bit briefly about the Nomad. I mean, for those of the viewers who really didn't know about the Nomad, please tell us a little bit about Nomad. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Nomad is it stands for Global Knowledge Partnership on Migration and Development. It is a global brain trust for the migration community. So as such, the idea is to create a menu of policy options for important challenges, important questions relating to migration, and do that through peer review mechanisms, through analytical work that relies on data as opposed to just opinion. And it has 9 themes right now. We call them thematic working groups. So those are the pillars around which activities are organized. The 9 themes range from data to refugees, to climate migration, to remittances and diaspora resources, migrant rights, internal migration, and labor migration. And for each thematic working group, we have a top-notch expert as the chair, then an international organization that specializes in the topic as a co-chair. For example, on labor migration, ILO is the co-chair, International Labour Organization. On return migration, IOM is the co-chair. So we have chair, co-chair, so an eminent expert, an eminent institution supported by a trust fund that has received money from currently European Commission, Germany, and Switzerland. Now we are just completing almost to the day 10 years after Nomad was launched, and to its existing knowledge window, the World Bank decided to add an operations window because migration work in the bank is now moving more towards operational support to countries, client countries. That includes both host countries as well as origin countries for migrants. And the idea is that the knowledge window will remain mostly the Nomad as we see it. The operations window will actually make grants available to client countries and organizations that will work with those countries so that they can do projects that address fundamental drivers of migration or promote that programs that support safe and regular labor migration or facilitate remittances, create jobs for return migrants. So those are sort of the programs that we are onto now. So Nomad is now also become the Nomad Migration Umbrella Trust Fund of the World Bank.
Thank you very much. Let me read the question that we received from our viewers. First, the question from Sasaki-san. Thank you for the question always. World Bank launched an international working group to improve data on remittance flows. Would you please mention where it stands now and reaction from the participating countries?
Koichi, could you repeat that again, please? For a moment, I was looking at something I lost.
Oh, sure. The World Bank launched the International Working Group to improve data on remittance flows. Would you please mention where this activity stands now? And also if you hear any reactions from the participating countries.
Excellent question. We mentioned this in the report briefly. Since the launch of the report, Actually, we launched the international working group to improve. Actually, we are calling it International Working Group on Improving Data on Remittances. It's a long name, and by now we have come up with a short name that somebody came up with, Remit Start. So it's called Remit Start Working Group. And very interesting that by now 45 countries have agreed to join. They have participated already in 2 meetings. We had 2 meetings already. The last meeting, second meeting was actually last week. And the third meeting will take place in September. 45 countries plus IMF, Eurostat, Universal Postal Union, and the World Bank. We are about 50 organizations participating in the working group. And the goal is to improve the data on remittances in terms of timeliness, because we realize that during the COVID-19 crisis, in countries where remittances are 25% or 40% of GDP, a small error can mean balance of payments difficulties. So many countries like Honduras, they started publishing data on remittances on a weekly basis. And in the last meeting, we were told by Bangladesh that they have started collecting data on remittances on a daily basis. So it's just incredible. And so we want to improve data on a timely basis, but also we want to address issues such as how much remittances are coming through different instruments, digital currencies versus cash versus banks, mobile wallets. Also, we want to understand where money is coming and where it is going to. So at least at a country level, which country to which country, bilateral remittances. And the final part, which we would not be able to do immediately, is by remittances by types of migrant. For example, do economic migrants send more money than refugees? And how much comes from economic migrants and how much from refugees? Or is it that refugees receive more money than send? Transit migrants receive money, they don't send money. I just pointed that out. So all these elements are being organized and discussed in the working group using like several thematic groups. So the 50 members are participating in different themes, and we are now trying to put together an outline of what kind of report we would produce and how we would produce it. So within a year, we hope to come out with guidelines on how to collect better data on remittances that would then inform the next balance of payments manual of IMF. And then we would also be ready to provide technical assistance to countries to improve collection of data.
Thank you very much for your responses. We received several questions from the anonymous participant. Thank you for sending your question always. Let me read this question. Creating a concessional financing facility for migration to support both destination communities experiencing a large inflow of migrants and origin communities experiencing return migration during the COVID crisis is suggested. If you have more concrete plans of supporting such facility, I would like to know how such facility should prioritize the target to support. Can priorities be decided in accordance with the economic level of hosting origin countries' communities, or concentration ratio and seriousness of the refugees or stateless people?
So this is a very practical question, and it has to be asked before the financing facility becomes operational. But prior to that, there is a key requirement that funds have to be mobilized. So in the process of mobilizing funds, I think there will be lots of give and take. And the idea is, the simple idea in its simplest form is that a country like Poland or Turkey or Colombia or Pakistan or Uganda, let's say, or Kenya, that receive a large number of migrants or refugees, and that has happened quickly, unexpectedly, we need to find ways to support these countries financially. So they identify the programs where they need support, and then different donors that want to support different aspects, they contribute money to the financing facility, which then channels the money and then keeps documentation and makes sure that the procurement and processes are followed and then reports back. That is the idea of the concessional financing facility. The idea is not to think about mobilizing another 2 million, 5 million. That is not going to cut it. We need billions of dollars. So the idea is to go from millions to billions. And if the concessional financing facility could complement or could be complemented by a contribution to IDA, for example, World Bank's IDA, that can actually work very well. When the refugee window was added to IDA, that had a significant impact on global governance of refugee issues, asylum seekers. So that is the same sort of idea that we are looking at with the Global Compact on global financing facility. Similarly, origin countries that are experiencing a large number of return migrants, they also need support. And there, the main thing is during COVID-19, provision of health services. These are, you need to support them quickly, and this is public money. It has to be public money. And then there is the medium-term need to create jobs for large number of return migrants who have come in, and then perhaps retool them so they can migrate again, right, to get a job. So those are the sort of activities that would be funded through the concessional financing facility.
Thank you very much for your responses. One more question from the same participant. The number of ratified countries to the UN Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families isn't many. Business and human rights principle is a guideline as a whole picture rather than legally binding. What kind of international system do you think the best to ensure the vulnerable peoples from exploitation? How do you see the trade agreement? Any comment, please?
It's again a very, very interesting and important question, an intelligent question. I say all of that because, indeed, when the global community came up with the idea of the Global Compact on Migration, remember that was because of the so-called refugees and migrants crisis in Europe, right? The Syria crisis, and then the African migrants and refugees that came into Europe, 2014, 2015. That's when the Global Compact was conceived. What is a compact? And that takes us to the sort of three things. A compact must have a clear set of guidelines to guide us on an issue. So a close comparator is the Geneva Convention that guides our treatment of refugee issues. So a set of guidelines. Then you need a lead agency that should govern, help govern. And the third requirement is actually funding, some kind of a multi-donor trust fund that needs to make our willingness to support effective. It is backed by ability to support. So we need a set of guidelines, a lead organization, and then the ability to support through financial means and knowledge. Right? So that is sort of the Global Compact. Now, if we are thinking about global governance, we have elements of that. The good news is that the IMRF, the International Migration Review Forum, the declaration was adopted more or less with consensus. Legally speaking, there was a consensus. With the Global Compact on Migration, there was a voting, there was no consensus. So in that sense, there is progress. But as the question, the colleague asking the question rightly points out, just because there is a universal declaration doesn't mean that a lot of countries will sign up to it. Even the Geneva Convention, not everyone has signed up to it, right, on refugee issues. So that is the problem with global governance. Sovereign states, they will do their things their own ways, and there is no way to really make everyone work. So that's where I sort of move towards a voluntary reporting framework for implementing migration related tasks. And that must start with some common areas where host countries, transit countries, origin countries, the stakeholders, they kind of all agree that something needs to be done. That's the basic common minimum denominator. I think we need to do better than that, but we need to start with something. And if you are thinking about where there is such a sort of unanimity, consensus, I think on reducing remittance cost, clearly there is unanimity. A sustainable development goal to reduce recruitment costs that are paid by workers, there is unanimity there. And other areas, maybe something on migrant rights, there is some consensus. I don't know that word, some consensus doesn't sound right? It has to be consensus, full consensus. So yes, we are now at the stage where we are trying to come up with guidelines, but without effective support through creating a financial means, nothing will happen. So we are far from having an appropriate global governance mechanism.
Thank you for your responses. We received a question during your presentation from the Professor Saito of the Tsuda College, Tsuda University. So let me read. Is there signs that structural change is taking place in international migration as a result of COVID-19 because of the expansion of the digital transformation and or change in work style?
Yes and no. Small yes and large no. Small yes for IT workers, clearly it is working. For bankers, more or less it is working. But for tourism, for grocery stores, it is not working. So I think in the case of low-skilled workers, it is still hands-on provision of work. So if strawberry has to be picked or the chickens have to be processed, that has to be done. And there is no substitute to that. There will be more automation, more mechanization, but we are far from, I think there would be still dependence on actual provision of work. So currently the COVID situation has sort of revealed that some sectors are more amenable to automation and remote work than other sectors. Interestingly, medicine is kind of halfway through. Telemedicine is possible, but surgery, of course, it is not possible. But large part of medical services are actually being done. Telemedicine is working. In teaching, maybe it works, not clear to what extent. Tourism, it hasn't worked very well. And hotel industry, that is clearly has been affected. Grocery stores and all that, I think, are in the middle. So this is mixed picture. We are not ready for complete remote work in the world yet. Meanwhile, I think it is worth pointing out that if you look at demographic projections, standard demographic projections that are available from the UN population census documents, forecast documents, nearly 300 million people will join the working age population in the next 10 to 15 years. 300 million new jobs have to be created. It's not easy to do that. So that kind of goes against this whole automation business. And we need to keep in mind the choice of technology kind of question has to be asked, because if we create more machines now and don't let those Africans come, they will then come illegally because they will have to come at some point. That's the problem that we are thinking of. So that takes me to a very bold sort of vision that we need to think about actually creating places and cities and countries that can receive these kind of people, migrant workers, because I know clearly we don't have space for all those people in our own countries now. I think that is a thought piece It's a very sensitive thing to say, but we need to begin to think about that.
Thank you. Dilip, before wrapping up this seminar, please give us like your final words, perhaps in 20, 30 seconds. Then we close the seminar.
Before, sorry, say it again.
Yeah, please give us your final remarks before wrapping up our seminar.
It's just to say a couple of words that migration is a very, very important issue pari passu climate change. And indeed, perhaps the most important adaptation to climate change is going to be migration, more effective and more likely adaptation mechanism. So we must give migration much more space in our policy discussions. And we need to now go beyond thinking about root causes to begin to address migration issues. And the beginning must start with a recognition on our part that it is an issue. There is migration. Migration is here to stay. Migration will grow, and we must address it instead of saying migration is not an issue. No, I don't think we can. We are beyond that stage now. So that would be my final statement, that migration is here to stay, and remittances are a financial lifeline to low and middle income countries. And we must do all we can to facilitate both processes.
Thank you very much. This morning, we had a pleasure of having Dilip Rasa, the World Bank's lead economist and head of Nomad, sharing the latest edition of the migration brief from Washington, D.C. Dilip, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we have interesting seminars, online seminars coming up. So please check the World Bank Tokyo office website for the update information. Once again, thank you for tuning in. Stay safe, stay healthy. See you next time. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.